Bonjour tout le monde, bienvenue à cet événement Perspective Quantum, le cinquième de la série. Je me présente, professeur Nicolas Godbout de Polytechnique et directeur de l'INTRIC, l'Institut transdisciplinaire d'information quantique. Il nous fait énormément plaisir de vous accueillir nombreux pour l'événement d'aujourd'hui, un événement organisé par l'ISEQ, l'industrie des systèmes électroniques du Québec, INTRIC, le Centre d'optique, photonique et laser, Québec Quantique, Optonique, le pôle de la photonique, et Numana. Donc, l'événement d'aujourd'hui aura lieu en anglais. We are very happy today to welcome Tom Hausken from the Optical Society of America, from Optica. You may have seen just a few days ago, I think it was Monday, the announcement circulating that Optical Society of America will henceforth be known as Optica, and I'm sure that Tom will say a few words about that. And Tom is a senior industry advisor at Optica and has been working for a couple of years, I believe, on the quantum photonics roadmap. It's not the first time that we received Tom to one of these series of webinars. Actually, I checked this morning, and it was exactly 1 year ago that Tom presented to us, did the first presentation on this quantum photonics roadmap. So today we'll be hearing about an updated version. And I hear that there were close to 100 registrations for today. So I will suppose that many of you will hear about the roadmap for the first time. So with that, I will yield the floor to Tom. It's really our pleasure having you.
Okay. Hey, thanks for the introduction. And I'm hearing an echo here, so I hope that doesn't cause any problems. By the way, j'ai parlé le français il y a longtemps, mais j'ai oublié beaucoup. Je parlais bien et maintenant c'est peu. Et bon, je vais parler en anglais. So first of all, just to confirm, can you see the slides? Suddenly my window sort of disappeared. So let me just make sure.
Yes, we can see the, oops. Yes, that is fine.
And I'm going to move this over here. Okay, so I have all these little windows here that so I can make sure to move everything. So yes, I believe this group is the first group to hear a presentation from Optica since Monday. After 105 years, we changed our name to Optica. It was OSA. First, it was Optical Society of America, and then 2008, they changed it to the Optical Society, but people kept the of America. And for 30 years, I guess they've talked about changing the name, and they finally started getting around to it. And it's been about a 2 to 3 year, or 5 years, depending on how you look at it, effort to try to come up with the name and change all the branding. And so that happened on Monday. And you all are the first group to see this presentation. Of course, there was the press release and all that. So I have to get used to using the new name as well. But it's going to go pretty smoothly, I think, from here. So I have the way this is going to work, I'm going to just do a very short introduction about the new name and then move on to some discussion about the market and how the optics and photonics industry is doing, and then work into quantum. So you'll see some of the things that I mentioned in the overall market and industry will come back into the discussion about quantum. And what I'm hoping is that can also stimulate a discussion among ourselves afterwards during the Q&A and discussion period, that maybe there are some things that you all would like to talk about, not just hearing from me, but I'd like to hear from you, and we can have a discussion about anything you want on some of these topics. So hopefully it's stimulating for you all. So first of all, let me just go ahead and do this video. So I usually don't like doing this sort of thing, but it's about 2 minutes. There is some sound. It's not going to come through the laptop, so I'll try to move the microphone over to the speakers. But the sound isn't really important. It's just sort of something about the new name change. So here we go. Okay, so yeah, you have now been introduced to Optica. Whoops. And on with the rest of the presentation. So as I said, I'm going to talk about the general market, kind of what's going on, and some things that will maybe bring it home to you for quantum. So quantum is a pretty researchy topic, speculative. There's a lot of fundamentals that still need to be worked out, but it also has to fit into it's a very exciting and dynamic place. There's a lot of investment going on, and so you want to see how that connects into everything else. So let me start with this cartoon. Let's go back a little bit to about a year and a half ago. If you remember, oh, if we just have some of these lockdowns, then maybe everything will be okay. The coronavirus isn't going to go away completely, but maybe we can really keep this thing in check. And here it is, 1.5 years later, and it's not clear just how long this thing will still keep going on. We have vaccines, but there's still so much more to do. So I first want to say, all kidding aside, this has been an absolutely horrific tragedy for millions of people around the world. First of all, the lives lost in the United States alone, in where I am, over 600,000 people have died. Several million people across the world, and of course the families that are impacted by that, the school children that missed out on education with their peers, uh, thousands of businesses closed, people out of work, just an immense tragedy. But what I'm going to tell you is that the optics and photonics industry didn't really do that bad through all this. We had a fairly cautiously upbeat perspective in March of 2020. Felt a little bit strange taking that position, and I'm not usually a cheerleader for the industry. I try to keep everything very straight and honest. And yet it did look like, okay, it wasn't going to be, and in fact, it turns out it was better than even that was. And so you may be wondering, well, why did our industry come out like that? So we'll talk about that. And so first of all, let me just show you this view about manufacturing. So this is US industrial output. You can see there's a lot of things going on in this particular chart. What you can see is it was starting to soften in 2019, just from general global economic conditions. And then it went off a cliff, of course, in early 2020. Very steep dive. This is a V-shaped supply side issue. So you remember the toilet paper issues? I don't know if that happened in Canada. You couldn't get toilet paper, you couldn't get baked goods, the shelves are all empty. A lot of disruption in the supply chain, still going on now, of course, with auto production, but also even in our industry, companies talk about not being able to get even the metal for heat sinks, but also exotic crystals for lasers, flash lamps for lasers, and you name it. There's just, things are very disrupted. But then what you see is coming along, digging itself out, and then don't pay too much attention to that spike in early 2021. So this is what happens when you do year-over-year growth numbers. Any kind of chart that you show has its issues. This particular one you're coming off of a very low base in March and April of 2020. So of course you get a spike. It's almost the mirror image of that. But the point is that it's starting to get back to kind of a normal level. We hope that that is going to be the ongoing trend. Now let me move on to show you what China was doing at the same time. Several things going on here as well. First of all, a better outcome, more steady growth going through 2019, and then it went off its cliff a little bit earlier. January and February in China reported at the same time because of the holidays there. But a sharper drop, less shallow, less deep, and then a faster recovery. Okay, and then you get that spike again in 2021 from just an arithmetic issue. It's not a real spike. And so what you see there is that East Asia, China in particular, but East Asia were able to get their factories back online by the end of March already, when things were really locking down and looking very, very bad in the West. The factories in Asia were starting to come back on again. And that kept not only our industry going, where so much of what we do comes out of Asia, whether it's displays or LEDs, or solar manufacturing, but also the high tech, all the telecommunications assembly, iPhones, all made in Asia. That was able to keep rolling for our industry, but the global economy as well. So much of the economy was able to keep running because of that. Now, we know hospitality was affected, travel industry, restaurants, all of that, but so much of the rest of the economy depends on all these other gears continuing to keep working. So that was one major factor right there. Another one was that a lot of our economy, so this is referring to the US, but it also happened, I'm sure, in Canada, and we know across Europe as well, and I think worldwide, the workforce was somehow classified as essential. So the New York Times did a study of the policies in 50 states and the federal government, and they found that about 2/3, according to them, about 2/3 of the workers were considered essential, a lot of those being frontline workers and essential. And then of the ones who were not, quote, essential, they were able to, a large part of those were able to work from home very effectively. I think this was a big surprise to all of us, that so much of the workforce was able to keep running in some fashion, one way or the other. Of course, huge disruption trying to work from home, but nonetheless, able to do it. Um, by the way, Stanford University did another study. They came up with about half of the workforce was essential. Still a much larger number than I ever would have expected. So this is another big factor in why our industry and the economy is able to keep going. Now, I will get to some other ones briefly, but now let me I talked about the V-shaped supply side disruption. The other big concern that we had was a longer term disruption to demand. Okay, so once all this stuff started to spiral down, you could suddenly have consumers, industry, everybody stopping buying, and you go into a long recession where a lot of things all just sort of come together, a perfect storm. And in fact, that didn't necessarily happen. So let me talk about a demand side issue. This is now not really related to photonics. It's very much related to a part of the economy that was affected by the pandemic, which is travel, air travel. And I think it's something that we can all relate to. So let me walk you through it, because we will get into how this relates to our industry in a minute. So this is US traveler throughput per day going through the security checkpoints, good measure of how much travel is going on. This is from March 1st of um, 2019 to March 1st of 2020. So this is a normal year in gray, what you see there. And notice that there's a little seasonal effect in August, or it starts falling off, and then you get the business travel in the fall and so on. Okay, now then this is from March 1st, 2020 to today. Actually, yesterday, redid the numbers for this presentation. And what you see is the travel suddenly drops off to about 4% of normal, came up to sort of a steady state in late 2020, about 30 to 40%. And then with the vaccines, started really recovering. Now, the thing is, it's falling off now just because of the normal seasonal travel. That's nothing to be really too concerned about. But what you notice is this is that curve. I don't know if you can see. Yeah, you can. You can see my cursor there in the normal year of 2019, that it kind of falls, and you see that it's lower now. It's lower because the international travel is down. Well, President Biden just lifted a lot of 35 countries from the travel ban because of the pandemic. And then also because of the business travel is down. So, and that's where a lot of the money is for the airlines. So it's good news to see that it's recovering, but it's not quite to where it used to be. Now, what does this mean for the airlines? The airline revenues were much more severely really affected because of these lucrative international and business travel side. So even though a lot of the traffic is back to normal, the revenues are not quite there yet. And then what does this mean for capital spending? Because so much of the optics and photonics industry is actually capital spending. It's not a consumable item like toilet paper or baked goods. These are items that, for the most part, you spend a lot of money on, even if it goes into an iPhone, which is a consumer, not exactly consumable, but it's a consumer item. Still, it's a large purchase. It doesn't happen that often. So when we look at our industry, we really have to think about how is industry or consumers, how are they looking at big purchases, more long-term purchases? In the airline industry, you see that the CapEx tracks revenues, but a little deeper, and it's going to take a little bit longer to recover. So that would be true widely across the industry, whether it's, I mean, not this exact sort of behavior, but if you think about capital spending, that happens in telecommunications, it happens in healthcare, it happens in security, national security, military equipment, that sort of thing. Um, and so all across the board, you can think about it this way to understand how our industry works. And by the way, it's going to happen with computing, quantum computers too. Not initially, because we're in the very early exciting phase of this, but at some point, industries, that's how they start to behave. So what do airlines spend money on in capital equipment? They spend it on commercial aircraft. That's easy. When you look at Boeing's a good company to check out. And see exactly what's going on here. You see the defense, space and security segment and the global services pretty much the same through the pandemic, but the commercial airplane deliveries and sales revenues from those deliveries dropped when they grounded the 737 Max, and then again it was disrupted during the pandemic, when the pandemic started, and then it's kind of recovering, but not what it was a few years ago. So Boeing's had some difficulties in that regard. And then you can even look, if you want, at Boeing's CapEx spending, because it is also a company in its own right doing manufacturing planes. And guess what? Some of that capital spending would be on things like laser laser-based machine tools for drilling holes or welding or that sort of thing. And so what you see is it's not too bad. The capital spending is tracking the revenue, but it's again a little bit worse. And so you can imagine the auto industries like this. They're not necessarily going out and buying laser-based tools for manufacturing. You can imagine, a lot of different fields being this way. It turns out that in the pandemic, it wasn't really as bad as we would have thought. And why is that? This is a recipe, an absolute, I was very sure in March of 2020 that this could be really horrible for the machine tool industry, but also for other sectors of the economy. Maybe not communications so much. If you imagine that with everybody going to online and Zoom, okay, the telecommunications industry, data centers, they all need to continue to invest in their equipment. Some of the life sciences down because people were not going and getting elective surgeries or procedures. Other life sciences doing well because they're trying to react to the pandemic. But overall, you would think machine tools would be one that's severely affected. Instead, it wasn't too bad. So this is the other thing about, or one more thing about the optics and photonics industry. I've left solar off of this because it's kind of a strange business in its own right, and I didn't want it to distract from this chart. What you see here, this is normalized to the first quarter of 2019. And these are normals, revenues of a set of companies. Each of this represents half a dozen or dozen companies in each of these different sectors. And we track 8, 7 are shown here. And if you normalize it to a different date, you'll get slightly different results. So I just want to point that out, that depending on how you do this, you can show lots of different things. But what's nice about this is that it starts in early 2019 and you get to see a couple seasons of behavior. So it goes up and then it goes down, and then it goes up and down. That's normal. That happens every year because of just the usual seasonal behavior of how these companies gather their revenues. But what you'll see when you come out, if you can see my cursor over on the right-hand side, there's 4 industries: machine tools, communications, displays, and life sciences, that did relatively well so far through the pandemic. And then there's 3 that did okay, but they didn't decline. Now, again, you would have thought going into this pandemic that there'd be a huge recession that would be kicking off, and there'd be some sectors that would be severely impacted. And of course, outside of optics and photonics, again, the cruise industry, airline industry, restaurants, hospitality, these were movies, movie theaters, all that. But in our industry, not so much. The worst ones that were affected, from what we can tell, were security, just kind of went along the same. They have their same contracts, a little bit disruption. LED lighting, consumer imaging, some issues there with prices and stuff. But and then displays up. They can't make enough displays in Asia, and that may change. Maybe it's possible that the demand will finally get satisfied, and so that'll decline. But for the time being, it's continued to be very high. Life sciences, again, a mix. There's a lot of elective procedures that were people didn't do, but on the other hand, there was a lot of money that went into COVID. Communications has done very well, and then machine tools. This is the one that you would expect would really be severely impacted. Instead, the semiconductor industry, for one, has had to continue to invest enormously into new tools for the future. They can't wait a few years. They have to be doing it now. Even the machine for the automobile industry, not a place where you think that you're going to be going and building new factories, but they're also looking at doing electric vehicles, and so they are investing. So even in a pandemic, even in a time like this, those businesses, a lot of them had been going into 2019 already a little bit low. And so you're coming off of a low base year. So the arithmetic of this, as I said, if you do it, normalize it a little differently, you'll get slightly different results. But this is another reason why our industry didn't really do so bad, is because of this sort of the different winds, the different currents that are going on in these different sectors, all sort of worked in our favor, at least so far. So the next chart shows what we expected in March of 2020. When the pandemic was in full force, we said, okay, this is a really bad one. The first couple quarters are going to be worse than usual, and then the rest of the year we'll start to dig out of it. And again, in March of 2020, that was a hard position to take. People just really, some people thought this was an absolute cataclysm, that unprecedented, that uh, even that was not foreseeable. But for us, we thought, okay, by 2022 we'll be back at the level of 2019, and which is bad, but we can recover from that. Instead, what happened was the last half of 2020 was very good for all the reasons that I showed you. And then now in 2021, even more. Usually there's a little dip at the beginning of the year. These seasonal effects haven't been so bad. There was a lot of demand that carried over from the previous year, so that wasn't as much of an effect as usual. And we'll see how the rest of 2021 turns out. But 2021 is definitely a growth year over 2020 and 2019. In fact, pretty high numbers so far, just because of that sort of base effect that you're coming off of a difficult year. And then 2022 going forward, we're expecting about 5% growth per year, which is pretty good. That's better than the global economy off of a very big number. Another thing that's going on, this is, I think, the last big effect that you have to understand, and sometimes this may seem a little bit remote for those of us in the hardware photonics industry, or if you're doing R&D. The financial markets have been very frothy, very exuberant in the last several years. And so we'll be talking about this more when it comes into quantum investment. But let me walk through this chart a little bit. So the Nasdaq Composite Index is shown in green. It has grown. Now, in the last month or so, there's been a little bit of correction, but this is as of, I think, July. It's been a compounded 20% growth per year over 5 years. So if you think about that, that's an absolutely um, incredible growth rate. You can question whether that's sustainable over a longer period, but in any case, over 5 years, it's 20% per year compounded. Don't worry too much about the U.S. Photonics Index, that it's greater than that. This is compiled by John Dexheimer. You can look it up in Laser Focus World magazine. Yeah, it's in the sort of same range, but the point is that it's kind of working off the same dynamics. So the companies that are strong in the Nasdaq, these are like Cisco and Apple, Facebook, Google, Intel, Tesla, et cetera, et cetera. Those are all companies that help our industry as well. So the companies that are in John's photonics index benefit from those same forces that are driving the Nasdaq. That's the point there. And then I've shown a 7% compounded growth rate. Just as comparison, 7% would be a very acceptable, healthy rate for the stock market over the period. So you can see what strong headwinds those are. Now, how does that matter for our industry? Well, what it means is that it's kind of like housing prices. When these things go up, it helps the valuations of companies in our space. Even if your company is not for sale, it helps, right? And it also means that money's flowing around for acquisitions and all that kind of thing. So it's good news in that sense. There was also, by the way, earlier this year, Coherent, long standing company in our industry, goes back to early 60s, went for sale, looked like it was going to go to Lumentum, and then MKS Instruments and 26 got into it. 26 ended up winning the bid for $6.9 billion and had to pay, Coherent had to pay Lumentum a fee of a couple $100 million, I think, to get out of the deal that originally had with Lumentum. So this is a big deal for our industry because this is a pure laser company, not systems, but just lasers. And then there's this whole thing about S-Pacs. So I don't know how much this audience is familiar with S-Pacs. These are special purpose acquisition companies. It's a way of getting onto the stock market without doing the usual initial public offering or IPO. A little bit less paperwork. There's some advantages, some disadvantages. It's been quite the popular thing to do over the last year or two. And a lot of companies getting into this. So now this is where we start talking more about what it means for quantum. So let's take a look at LiDAR companies. And there is one company in here that's not LiDAR, Rockley Photonics. So there's a lot in this slide. So let me just walk you through it. First of all, these are the closing prices of these stocks. Because they're S-Pacs, what it is, a company gets some cash and then they go around looking for somebody to buy. And then when they buy them, it gets traded under the new, they change the name and it gets traded under the name of the company that they bought. So the first one in this group was Velodyne. It's in yellow here. So they're at $10 a share until they go public. And then there's hopefully a bounce or spike there. But then you notice that there was it's been up and down, up and down. And Velodyne is a little bit strange because they've had some disputes among their board of directors between the founder and I think his brother-in-law is also on the board, and there's some interesting stuff going on there. But anyway, you see other companies, Luminar, you may have heard about them. These are very much photonic companies because they're using photonic techniques to do the LiDAR. It's all through the stuff. And let's see, there's still one more company to go. Quanergy is not listed here. AI is a more recent one. Quanergy is not listed here. And then we've listed Rockley Photonics, even though it's not LiDAR. That's this dark one here coming in later. And IonQ, a quantum computing company, is hoping to get listed soon. So they're going through the process. I think the board of directors is voting on whether to accept it or not. Now, there's also this index here called the S-Pac Index. So this is an index of stocks. I don't know exactly how they do it, but it includes all kinds of S-Pac stocks that have gone this route over the last couple of years. So this includes DraftKings, Virgin Galactic, and many more, completely unrelated to photonics. And what you see is that these stocks, first of all, they're going down. That's not good. And in fact, nearly all of them are below the $10 number where they started, for the original cash. But the other thing is that they're kind of tracking this S-Pac index, which is a little strange because you'd say, well, they should have their own trajectory, they have their own path, and yet they're kind of tracking S-Pacs. Why would that be? And then that gets into the discussion of just the entire stock market and how it moves up and down and all that. So this could be an opportunity if you say, well, these are long-term bets, these are good opportunities, so you should buy low and they'll go up eventually. you know, whatever you think, but this is what a big thing that's going on in the industry is companies are looking for this, and in fact, maybe some of the shine has come off the S-Pacs that if you try to get into this now, it's starting to get a little late. That the SEC is looking into a little bit more regulation on them, whether everything is all fair and, you know, good for the investors and all that. So again, Rockley is in there now. Quanergy is still to go. IonQ. And I'm sure there's going to be more, and we probably maybe lift a few out here. So there's a lot of exuberance going on for sure. That can be good for the quantum space, but it's also can be complicated. And I meant to include a chart of the Gartner hype curve here, which is another one that takes a little bit of explanation. If you're familiar with the Gartner hype curve, you may have seen it. It sort of goes up really high on the expectations for a technology, for example, goes up really high, and then there's this deep trough of what they call trough of disappointment, and then it comes back. And first of all, it's not a law. There's nothing that says that anything has to follow that curve, and also it doesn't go in a steady progression of time. It can go to a place and stop, for example, or it can skip. But what I think it really talks about is our personal expectations. So what happens a lot in something like LiDAR is you need to have the components first just to be able to make these self-driving cars and to make the LiDAR. So you have to have the components, the companies look and kick the tires, they try to understand, okay, what's the best? This takes a long it's a long process, takes a long time. And then once you've been through a lot of that, sure, Google has their cars out on the road and Tesla's doing some of the things that it's doing, but then you start working that into the next generation of cars. So it takes a long time. And it's the same thing with quantum. We're going to talk about quantum now very soon, but it's the same thing, is that especially the media will get very excited about self-driving cars or quantum computing in particular, and they'll write all about it. And then the average person will say, hey, whatever happened to that? And so they will perceive that there's a hype curve and that it goes through this trough of disappointment or whatever. Whereas, in fact, I think if you're in the industry and you understand how it's working, uh, it's not like that at all. And you can see it coming, you can see it happening, but that is also very much how the media works and how our own personalities work, that how we see things. So um, so you'll see a lot of this stuff reflected in the stock market, and make of it what you will. So what about quantum? Venture money's definitely flown into quantum. This is from PitchBook from just a couple weeks ago. These are global VC deals in quantum computing. Now, quantum is a lot more than just computing, but this is what they're looking at. Notice in green, the deal count. The year is not over, so we'll see what it comes out at by the end of the year. But the deal value is up already, and it's not even October. If you want to see some of the top deals here, there is Canada's own Xanadu out of Toronto with a deal in May for $100 million. PsiQuantum is talking about going, well, IonQ for sure is talking about going through the S-Pac route to the stock market. And I think they show there the post-money valuation of $192 million. But I think what I've heard is that when you put it all together, they're expecting, once the S-Pac is done, they're expecting that it will be, I think, a couple $1 billion as well, similar to PsiQuantum, what PsiQuantum is listed there. And there's a lot of other companies as well. One out of Quantum Machines out of Israel was recently announced. And I think there is a company that, I can't remember the name of it, that is actually listed on the stock market, but it's on the over-the-counter market. So it's kind of it's called a micro stock. But I think we'll be seeing more about those coming up. Now, I want to, this talk, it's a review of what I talked about last year. So I'm going to show some charts from last year and some new charts. And again, kind of maybe as much a stimulus for discussion. It's not so much of a tutorial of everything that's going on or what's in the roadmap, but more of a review and stimulate some discussion. So one thing that comes up a lot is what's Europe doing? We hear a lot out of Europe. This is something from a venture capital firm. It's about almost a year old. And what you see on the left-hand side, that's the part I'm more interested in, is the components, materials, and hardware. And a lot of, this is not complete, but there's a lot of names in there, a lot of exciting things going on in Europe. And this is some of the startups. I don't necessarily put a lot into these their particular list, but it's just a little bit interesting to see, for example, accumulated the top countries and for numbers of startups, the UK, Germany, France, top countries in cumulative funding, UK, Finland, Israel, Switzerland, France. And so I'm not sure about those numbers exactly, but anyway, it's interesting. UK is very proud of their position here. So it may be that they are number one. I would have thought Germany might be second, but this is really interesting to me. Now let me walk you through it. There's a lot on here. So this is deal count is the lines and the columns are the funding. And the blue line is North America and the gray line is Europe. So what you see is the deal count is running a little higher in North America, but in the last couple of years, it's about the same. So it's 2019 and 2020, about the same number of deals for venture capital for quantum stuff. By the way, this is quantum. And then what you see on the columns, though, these blue columns, is the amount of money coming out of North America for those deals is about 5 times greater than what's in Europe. So Europe is getting a lot of news about little deals, whereas North America has a lot more money going into it. Also in North America, you have Amazon, Microsoft, Google, IBM putting a lot of money privately into quantum computing, or quantum generally. And there are companies in Europe as well, Bosch and so on, but not to the same extent, I don't think. And then, of course, there's also the national labs and university funding. And we were talking just a little bit before this about how much funding is going on worldwide. So I think sometimes you hear more news, there's more splash coming out of Europe, but there's maybe more money and certainly a lot going on this side. The other thing is everybody's got a consortium. So consortium can mean a lot of different things. It might just be a way of doing some university funding. So they get together all their pals and they create a consortium, and that's fine. But what I'm talking about here is more specific about a business type consortium. And I want to talk about this a little bit. In the US, there's one called QEDC, the Quantum Economic Development Consortium. Initially, my understanding was it was supposed to be for US companies only. I think they've loosened that up a little bit. I know, for example, Toptica has an office in the US, so they said, well, that's okay. You get to join for that. And so I'm not sure exactly. They have maybe a different types of memberships and so on, but they are restrictive in certain ways, that they're trying to develop an ecosystem. So this is not about research and development, or maybe it's about the development part of that. It's really about developing an ecosystem. And I can tell you, I've been participating in it. OSA/Optica, now Optica, is a member of QEDC, and it's a hard process. It takes a long time to really get it going, and they're working very hard, and I think they're doing a really good job with it. And still, it takes a long time to really get everything going. And they were formed out of the government National Quantum Initiative efforts. So that's with money and the blessing of the US government. And so I think what you see in Europe, you have a similar thing here, this quick quantum industry consortium. It comes out of the quantum flagship out of the European Union. Very similar thing. It's got the blessing of the European Union. It's got some money, etc. And I can say it's going to take a long time for them to really get it going. It's all good. We're all glad to see it, but it's hard to get really tangible benefits out of these things. But nonetheless, you got to start somewhere. And I think you'll be hearing a little bit more about those sort of things. Also, the consortia with universities in the US, there's a lot of different things that Department of Energy and NSF is doing, not to mention the other agencies. And it seems like every month I hear about some new sort of group that's working on things. So there's a lot of different efforts, a lot of overlapping efforts. And it's all good, but it's we're waiting to see what comes of it. Everyone also has a national agenda. And I don't know why I'm picking on France here. So I just kind of thought, I don't know if it's just me, if anybody else thought that the title of this report was a kind of a curious title. They're not saying that France is going to be leading the way or, in first place. They're saying they're just not going to miss out. But everybody has a plan like this. France is actually pretty significant. It's in the billion some euros. I can't remember exactly what the amount is, but again, it's taking some time for it to get off the ground, and it includes a lot of different things about helping startups and all those sort of things. And there's also Netherlands has a lot going on. Germany, UK, of course, very famous. Canada as well. Early on, Canada had took a position in quantum. US maybe a little bit later. And then, as I said, was saying before the talk, what's going on in China? That is the big mystery. Continues to be a mystery. I reached out to China, talked to a couple people there, could not get a clear answer on how much they're spending. First of all, this particular news item, it shows a Google device, but it's really about China. China made a claim in June that it beat Google's performance metric of, quote, quantum supremacy. That was back in June. And then now this month, about a week ago, I think it was, they claimed that they've done even better. They have 60 qubits. You may have heard about that. And I watched a presentation from the Q2B event. That's an event that's in Santa Clara in December, but they had a little webinar last week. It was very good. Scott Aronson and a couple other people on this panel, and what they were saying was that, yeah, they're up there with Google. That's significant in its own right. The quality of the qubits isn't so good, so it's not clear that they really beat Google. And anyway, we're really at the very early stage. This is kind of the Wright brothers building a plane that flies for a few feet and then falls. So they're demonstrations. It's all good. What it does say is that China is really doing some big things, though. Like, they are not years behind. They're right up there doing some really good things. Have they won the race? Of course not. But I think it was perceived that China was strong in quantum communications because of what they did with satellites, doing quantum encryption, quantum key distribution. But now they're showing that, well, they're doing some good things in quantum computing as well. But how much money are they spending? Total mystery. They announced that in 2017, I think they said that they were spending, it came out to $10 billion. That was in one newspaper, English language newspaper out of China, was never really confirmed. I have no doubt in my mind that from what I've heard from China, that people in China, it hasn't necessarily all been approved. It wasn't necessarily approved. And if it was approved, or whatever it was, a lot of it may be going really to real estate deal. So in other words, it's a way of building a campus, and you're putting in buildings and all these different things, and it's not necessarily for people and buying light tables or optical benches and stuff. So let me just go briefly, since we're talking about the regional hot topics before 2020. I talked about hot topics last year in this presentation, but I didn't show this chart. In North America, it's really driven not by these big government projects, but it's by what I call the Apple economy: consumer products, autonomous vehicles, AR, VR, 5G, IoT, AI, cloud, and that includes quantum computing. Self-driving car, yeah, I said that, autonomous vehicles. In Europe, a little bit more driven by some of these big projects like Industry 4.0, you'll hear a lot about, the quantum flagship. And then, of course, before 2020, Brexit was, it's not an R&D project, but very much on everybody's minds. And then in China, you have things like the Belt and Road, Made in China 2025, and quantum, that are big government programs that make a difference in what's going on. Well, 2020 was all about the pandemic. All these other things were going on in background, but everybody was really distracted by the pandemic. And here we are in 2021. Hasn't really changed. We're sort of at the same point where we were before. But in the US, we have Biden administration. There was a stimulus package. They're talking about an infrastructure package. R&D spending may change a little bit. Trade policy may change a little bit. Interest rates are still low. In Europe, now Brexit is a fact. And in China, all those other things are there, but there's also this thing called China Standards 2035. That's been in the works for a while, but it's starting to get more exposure now. So it's China's saying, not only do we want to make more stuff in China and import less, but we also want to have a bigger say in what the standards are in the future. And that's a big deal. It's, kind of a dry topic, but a very big deal. So this is our very, very abbreviated view about quantum, where it's going, the three major areas: sensing, communications, and computing. With sensing, the more near term number of things that need to be happen there. We're looking at more miniaturization. Communications, same thing. We need a quantum repeater for that to really get to quantum networks. And then quantum computing, yes, we technically have some quantum computers now, but what everybody really wants is fault tolerant quantum computers, of course. None of that has really changed. And what the rest of the talk, I'm probably going to skip some slides. The rest of the talk is really more about the roadmap. And what I would say is the roadmap is still very much, I think, current. There's not a lot in there that we would change. We're talking about having some meetings to go through and really go with a fine-tooth comb and not so much change anything, but probably add more detail, just go down a level and add more detail. But I did want to touch on a few highlights here of some conversations that have happened over the last year. So first of all, on quantum sensors, this is what you see. A lot of really amazing things. And I'm leaving optical clocks out of this for now. I see some really amazing things, but they're very large, require a PhD with a screwdriver to go in and fine tune. And that's what we want to get away from. And this particular chart shows different products in optical clocks. So this is one that's actually out there, been out there in the market for some time. The one real commercial product in quantum, I guess. There's a few others, but this is one that's been around for quite a while. And what you see in the lower left-hand corner are some more lower priced products that smaller, less precision, of course. And then you have up on the upper right, some very large ones, incredible precision, also very expensive. And so what they want to do is to try to reduce the size, weight, and power and cost. Swap seat. So a conversation that came up was, well, wouldn't it be great to use integrated photonics, for example, just to reduce all this down? And not necessarily for optical clocks, but for a lot of things that are happening in quantum. Now, for some things like quantum communications, or particularly what Xanadu or Psi Quantum are doing, maybe the integrated photonics is actually essential. It's a fundamental part of your technical technology approach. And so it's providing something you can't do any other way. And so it's essential. But for some other ones, maybe it's not essential so much, but it will reduce the size, weight, and power and cost. And what the companies told us is like, well, yeah, but that can be really expensive. Right now, they just want to get this stuff commercial at all, a little bit smaller, and they want people to use it and adopt them into their applications. So before they leap all the way to some really small or really low cost solution, they want to just get this stuff out a little at a time, because that can be very, very expensive for a company to do. So that was kind of interesting to us that, yeah, of course, if they could do it, they would, cheaply, but there's just so much engineering that has to go on. Quantum communication, this is from 2017, a couple real hero experiments that went on in China. I could be wrong. I haven't heard of a lot of these sort of hero achievements. They did a good job back then, both in space and terrestrially. Our timeline is still approximately the same. You can go to the roadmap and look that up. But one thing that has happened is I'm not able to put all the news, achievements, announcements financially or technically that are into this presentation. But one company, this is Arcit. I think it's out of the UK. They are a quantum encryption company. They started trading on the Nasdaq via an S-Pac. So that's one that I didn't get to put on. And they have had a good, so far, it's very short. It's only since September 3rd, but they've had a good trajectory so far. So that's an exciting development to see. Quantum computing, you've seen a lot of Schrodinger cat jokes. This is one that I think is very appropriate for quantum computing. Yes, there are some early successes like the Wright brothers plane. And yes, it hasn't even started as well. So it's really true. It's both superposition of both states. And it gets a lot more of the media attention. And it also gets a lot more of the money. So these are a couple old charts from before. Even the words quantum supremacy is now disputed. that maybe it's an inappropriate word. In any case, timeline approximately the same. Again, a year's gone by. That hasn't really changed so much. I want to skip over some of this. Just that this is from last year's presentation. This is an update of Yole's market forecast. This is for all three major application areas. So sensing and timing, cryptography, and computing. They actually downgraded their forecast a little bit from 2020. Sorry, it should say 2021, 2025, 2023. So they've added a year to it, but they downgraded a little bit. And I was a little bit surprised at that they're being very cautious about it. And I think they're actually undercounting. Maybe optical clocks is bigger than they think it is. And again, if you say that there's some quantum computing products out there from companies like D-Wave and so forth, then they're undercounting quantum computing. So maybe what they're doing is they're being very careful about what they include in that. So you'd have to go to the report and look up the details to understand that a little bit. By the way, what I should say too is there's a company called Hyperion Research that did some work for QEDC. So it's confidential, proprietary to QEDC, so I can't show it, but I did look up some numbers yesterday, and they have much bigger numbers for the market for, and they seem to be quite reputable. I like the work that they did. So for 2021, I counted about $360 million for the quantum computing area, and they are counting software. They broke it up a lot into software for apps, software for middleware, professional services, etc. So they're really including everything. But the hardware alone looked to me like about $135 million for 2021. Much more than what Yole shows. And then for 2024, they have the whole thing rising to about 835 million. So these are not, tens of billions of dollars, but they are rising numbers. Everybody likes to see that. And another thing that's important to note is that the hardware in this is not necessarily the biggest part. And so, well, I have a couple charts about that in a minute. So if it's not such a big market, then why is everybody so interested in it? Well, it's fear, of course. Fear of missing out or downside risk management. Google's worried, IBM's worried somebody else might come up with something and leave them behind. Also, US government, I suppose China too, major European governments, and then everybody else. Even if your country is not going to be a powerhouse in building a quantum computer, you need to have people who understand it, whether it's to buy the equipment or to use it or whatever. You need to have some ecosystem just to keep up with everything else. Now, maybe it's a big risk. You don't think that it's going to pay out in the big way that a lot of people do, but nonetheless, it's downside risk management, what they call it on Wall Street. And so that is a huge, huge driver to this. So this is a chart that I showed last year. I'll repeat it again. On the right-hand side is that the Hyperion Research, Yole, what they think, you can take a guess how many billions of dollars sometime in the future there. That's the three major areas. In the meantime, corporate R&D spending, venture financing, government financed R&D, both classified and unclassified, we estimate about $2 billion a year. Of that, maybe a couple $100 million in equipment, 2,000 or 3,000 people that supports going into the R&D. So that can be a good market until you have the end product market on the right-hand side. And so we estimate that for photonics alone, in lasers and detectors, single photon detectors and all that, about $100 billion per year, maybe more, but something in that scale. And that's a lot of what our optics and photonics industry actually does. We do a lot of that in life sciences, life science research, also just scientific research. Anybody that's working on LIGO experiment and so forth, that's going into sort of this R&D market. It can be very good for a lot of companies. So a lot of components are needed. I'm going to skip over this. Every photon counts. It's in the title of the report. Integrated photonics, great technology to watch. It may be essential for some of the things that you're doing. It may be also good in other words. Science, the big problem is we need to go more towards the engineering. And for those of you who are scientists and you say, well, you made the demonstration, which we have. We've done, most of this has been demonstrated now in some fashion in the lab. And so a scientist will say, well, now the rest of it's just engineering. But really what the engineers have to do is they have to go back and redesign everything to be a commercial product. And that may not work. So just because you've demonstrated in the lab doesn't mean anything. It has to be engineered. So looking at something that goes from this for a quantum computer, this is from Rigetti, or this for transportable optical lattice clock, to something more like this. This is a gravimeter fitting into a MEMS package. Now, I do want to talk about this for a moment, and then I'll wrap up. So what I said last year is that there's a whole stack of disciplines that you need to have to come together. And of course, I'm interested most in the photonics, and I tend to dismiss things like electrical control. But in quantum computing and other quantum things, that electrical control is huge. It's a huge, huge problem trying to get everything in there into a very small space, maybe crowd temperatures, but also the mechanical, thermal cryogenics, and then the whole software stack. And then you have to have applications that actually do something useful that save somebody some money or solve a problem for them. And if you think about classical computing, they've had decades to work all this out gradually as the technology advanced. In quantum, they're trying to do all of this at once, and they're doing a pretty good job of it. But what you'll see now is everybody's got a program on education, quantum education, everyone. And I'm sure Canada has some fine programs too. OSA, now Optica, hosted a couple NSF workshops on the topic, and there's a lot of nice work going on to developing curricula, and that takes time. So they need to get started soon so that they have that, so that they can groom the next generation of engineers. However, that's great. And there's even talk about K through 12 education and all that. That's all great. But you don't necessarily need an army of quantum physicists who understand the deep, deep fundamentals of quantum. You need to have all these other people, electrical control, photonics, mechanical. You need to have an ecosystem of good engineers. And one thing that came up in the workshop last week was how countries that are successful are the ones that have the good national labs. They have companies around them. They have good universities all together. That you can't do this stuff all by yourself. You need to have this big ecosystem. And I consider Quebec part of a really good ecosystem in that way. And so that's very important. So yes, the quantum education is important. That's all great, but you really need to have all the rest of it too. And by the way, that's a big challenge in the United States, is developing just all these other types of engineers. So the number of key takeaways, I'm going to skip through this. I think I talked about most of them. That's a lot more than I expected. That's a lot more time than I expected to take. I was hoping to leave about 15 or 20 minutes of discussion in addition to the next session that we have. Just a quick run through. We're very active in this area. There's an event coming up in early November that's co-located with our annual meeting. There's also a conference next year. We'll be doing Quantum 2.0 again, probably in June next year. There's the report. You can look it up, optica.org/industry roadmap if you're not an OIDA or OSA Optica member. If you're a corporate member, this is there's a lot of events. You get discounts too. You can participate in the reports. You get a lot of different things that we're doing, job programs and so forth. There's technology showcase coming up. This is an old banner, but there's another one coming up in a couple of weeks. Encourage you to check it out. And that's it. So if you have questions about Optica, please check out industry@optica.org. Questions for me, you can send me an email, thausken@optica.org. But what I'd really like to do now is open up, there's time for Q&A, but also a chance for you all to talk among yourselves or with me about any of the things that came up in this talk, because I think that's very important for us to just talk about what are some of the issues that you see, or some of the questions or observations that you have. So thanks for having me back, and I hope that I've touched on some things that are stimulating to you.
Thank you very much, Tom. We will, yes, definitely take time for Q&A. And also, if we still have time, we will also keep open the Remo platform that we use for these events now, which, as you've seen when you connected, allows you to talk in smaller groups and meet, try to replicate as much as possible the experience we used to have, where we could chat, meet some people, get chance meetings and talk about different subjects. So I will invite you to ask your questions on the general chat. I will keep an eye on that. I did see some reactions, many thumbs up when you mentioned the Québec ecosystem. And, scanning the list of participants, I recognize a lot of names from a lot of backgrounds interested in participating in building this ecosystem in Quebec. And I have a question for you, Tom, related to that. You had a slide numbered 25. Well, we don't really need a slide. You mentioned the consortia. You said everybody has this consortium and it's really hard to do. It takes time, it takes investment. But still, in the list that you were showing, there was a glaring omission. I didn't see Canada on the list, and in the list of countries having such a consortium. So would you have any advice if you want to go forward and build such a consortium with participation of private enterprise and all the players in the ecosystem? What would be your advice? The mistakes that some others may have made, good practices? We'd be happy to hear you about that.
Yeah, that's a good question. So I've worked on consortium type efforts over many years. And first of all, I think it's probably easier to get involved if you can in other consortia that are already existing than to go out and do your own. I mean, you have a consortia in a way yourself. You have this cluster, right? And it has certain purposes, maybe certain funding. So if you can be involved in the European consortia or QEDC in some fashion, I think that would be a lot easier, because there's just so many costs to it, and inertia, right? And I think the expectations that get very high. So people join. If the roadmap is another good example. People say, well, we need to have a roadmap. And then you say, well, what is that roadmap going to look like? Everybody's got a different idea of what the roadmap is. And then you say, well, it sounds easy. You go in and you write a roadmap, and this is what we need for the future. And then you start finding out, well, companies, they don't necessarily want to talk about it. And getting everybody together is hard. And so I think if you can somehow be involved in one that's already going, that is much better. But also what I see is Canada, it has, I don't recall the exact announcements, but I think they have something going with the UK. I know France has something going with Netherlands. So there's a lot of these sort of deals where people are working together. And I'm not sure exactly what comes out of it, but it may be as effective or more effective than any kind of formal consortium, really. If you have, just partnerships where people can go and work in each other's environment, just getting people together and talking, right? That's the main thing. Something that came up in the workshop last week was they were saying that in the US, so they were talking about China. In fact, the whole topic was China. And they were saying that what you see is you see a lot of Chinese that come to the US, and many of them go back. You don't see Westerners going to the Chinese. Like if you look at the papers coming out of China, you don't see a lot of Westerners on the papers. And that ultimately this is to the detriment of China, that it's good for the US and Western countries. Now that's a complicated topic, but I guess that's the idea. Anything that you can do to work together, it doesn't have to be a formal consortium.
Yeah, okay, very good. There's a comment by Felix that there is Quantum Industry Canada that has already been set up a few years ago. So I get your message. It doesn't have to be a very formal or very, put a lot of things on paper, but at least have people talking. I think we see that currently in the province with the Québec Quantique, which is, a new platform. So I would invite members of the assistance, if you want an entry into the ecosystem, I would suggest looking there first. I would also point out that the last year's presentation that you made for us, Tom, was recorded and it's still available. If you're curious, you can, I believe if you look at Numana's website, you would be able to find it, to find a trace. So if you're interested, you could also see last year's presentation. I think there was another question, the Q&A. Is there anything in the Biden infrastructure plan touching quantum technologies?
Oh, that's a good question. Not that I know of. So we have somebody at Optica who works on the advocacy issues. It's a lot of different, like, for example, once a year, they bring people into Washington to go talk to their congressional representatives and so forth. And so he tracks all the things that are going through. And honestly, I kind of take a little bit. I used to work in Washington. I used to work on Capitol Hill, in fact. I used to work for Congress myself. Uh, but with those things, being out in California, I guess I wait until it's close to a presidential signature before I get too involved. To my knowledge, there's nothing specifically in there. On the other hand, there is money in the legislation, and I saw a chart the other day where I was thinking of including it here. The growth is actually quite substantial. So it looks like um, there's more money than I expected going into quantum from the U.S. But again, it's complicated because they may be taking some old money, giving it a new name under a new banner, or they may be taking somebody else's money and now it's somebody's losing out and it's becoming quantum. So I'm not sure exactly how that's working out, but I don't think it's a particular thing going on in the infrastructure plan. No.
Okay, but you did see increased funding in the R&D for R&D in general.
Yeah. Now, who knows when it's all done? Sometimes things, at midnight, something gets stuck into the bill to get
Yeah,
it through, and
yeah.
so we'll see. It's a big one.
Okay, okay. Another question. What are your thoughts about repeaters for quantum communications? I think you
Yeah.
mentioned it briefly. So you see it as a necessary component to well, at least for the quantum internet, but in the market, is that
Yeah.
required
So
for the market?
So you all would be the bigger experts on the specific science or technology of the repeater. That's a tough one because for the networks, we really need those repeaters, right? And it looks to me like they're still a long ways off, but you have to try. And so there are some NSF programs, for example, that are really working on that just to demonstrate something. And then maybe in 10 years or more, who knows, maybe they can start having some early accomplishments. So you start now and you see what you can do. Uh, what's kind of interesting to me is this whole area of the quantum communications without those repeaters. There was a company called Quantum Exchange. I believe they're out there trying to sell the services. So it's other people's equipment, and they will set it up and sell services. And I think there are some actual revenue generating key exchange links in place. And then there's this other company that got listed on the Nasdaq. So there is a little bit of movement there, but I don't see things necessarily taking off. And one telecom executive explained it to me that they said, well, keep in mind that you're competing with a guy with a suitcase and a handcuffs strapped to the suitcase. That's the kind of stuff that you're competing against. And so yeah, it seems like this very elegant technology, and yet at the same time, uh, companies are very careful with that sort of thing, just to go out and make the changes. So even without the repeaters, it's tough, but getting the repeaters seems to be a long ways off. So it's a good challenge.
But to come back to another point that you made, that there's a sizable market, a sizable R&D market in the short term. So there might be also a market in the meantime for subcomponents, some parts at least of
Absolutely.
the repeaters, which is
Absolutely.
maybe one
You know,
advantage of the photonics industry.
let's say something else about this consortium kind of going on. Something that happens, this fear of missing out. It's hard to emphasize how important that is. Again, it's FOMO, or if you're on Wall Street, you call it downside risk mitigation. So what happens is you'll see China does something. They'll launch a satellite and they'll have some quantum encrypted, key exchange, and then the West will say, "Oh my God, we need to respond to that." And then there'll be in the US maybe a quantum initiative. Meanwhile, maybe several years ago, the UK did something, and then you look at that and you say, look what they're doing. So there'll be a flagship in Europe, and then the US has to have a national quantum initiative. And then the US will come out with a big report, and then Europe will say we need to report to. Well, U.S. has a consortium, they need a consortium, and these things help to drive each other forward. They're very important. So whether each particular thing, how much it contributes, it might be small or hard to measure, but it all adds to the total, right? And so, yeah, I think in the meantime, there is a business for the companies that are doing this, and the goal may be a ways off. And again, to the person on the street who's reading the media, they may see this as up and down. But for those of us in the industry, we realize, okay, it takes a long time, and you have to have this sort of friendly competition to drive it forward. But sometimes the results are slow in coming. But we could still have a lot of nice work going on inside the industry.
Okay, nice perspective. I have a last question regarding China. So the question is, if you have an opinion about the fast recovery of China compared to the US after the the effect of the pandemic. Do you have theories why it's working? Is it working better in China? And if so, what would be the reasons?
I'm sure my theories are no better than you all. I mean, they have a certain discipline when it comes to manufacturing, and their social, it's more group driven, and in the US at least, it's very individual driven, our culture. And boy, did we learn a lot about things with the pandemic, didn't we? So we learned some good things that okay, Zoom and all this, people could actually, turns out they could work from home. It's not easy. Nobody necessarily wanted it, but wow, look what happened. That was a real surprise. On the other hand, we have a lot of vaccine resistance and so forth. I think that was also a big surprise. So we learned a lot. But one thing that came out of this is like, yeah, China had that discipline. Actually, to be fair to ourselves too, don't forget, like 50 to 67% of our workforce in the U.S. was considered, quote, essential in some way, and so that meant that a lot of factories and so forth, the trucks are able to stay on the road, the factories keep running, whether they were so essential or not, I don't know, but it kept the economy going. And I think in China or Taiwan, think about Taiwan, everything the whole Taiwan economy is based on assembling things for export for outside countries. Every job is in Taiwan may be considered essential with that definition.
Mm. Yes, and yeah, you mentioned toilet paper. I mean, we never missed on toilet paper. It was shortage, short time shortages, but yeah, it's true that all in all, most of the activity continued almost as normal. All right, so I don't see any more questions. If you have some time, Tom, if you can stay a little bit with us, right after we turn off the presenter mode, we'll all go back to this, big conference room where you can hop around the tables, meet different people. So if you're interested in having smaller group discussions as you invited earlier, then of course you're invited to stay with us for a while. Thank you very much, everybody. And until next time, continue to look for our announcements to complete this series of webinars. Thank you. Have a good day.